Welcome to the next installment of Emily Bronze. The Bell Dam has heard your critiques about her speed, so we'll see how she does now, won't we? There's also our first affiliate, Skull Splitter Dice. Skull Splitter Dice is a small, veteran-owned, family-run business based in St. Petersburg, Florida, and they make a whole selection of dice for D&D and any other war games. Most importantly, I think, is that they make a whole bunch of metal dice. And the metal dice and the other dice come in these sets, and the sets include like a velvet bag or a cool like metal pop-top tomb or a lock-picking kit or a dwarven battle chest. All kinds of cool little dice holders that give you a nice little bit of character into your usual D&D setup. Also, they have articles on D&D for new players or new DMs just getting into it. So if you need dice, hop on down, buy some here, because Lord knows you dice goblins love your click-clack shinies. Let's get on with it.
Chapter 2. The New Fish. Logan, Utah had all the city comforts packed in a small-town charm, and the view of the mountains that surrounded it was gorgeous to boot. While it was a relatively small town before the collision of dimensions, the population almost tripled overnight due to the sudden influx of beings that decided to call it home. The majority of them all exclaimed how familiar the place looked, as if all the dimensions shared a place just like it within their boundaries. Emily's trip there was nothing to really write home about unless you were a reporter on just how disgusting roadside diners and their bathrooms could be. Camping out was a nice change of pace from her usual time in her apartment, and it helped her get into the state of mind needed to start her new career. Utah and Wyoming had no shortage of campsites and KOAs along its roads, and it was easy stays, for the most part. Interestingly enough, there were a lot of people that just camped out or lived on the grounds, not wanting to be near even the smaller towns on Terra. There, at the campgrounds, one could find beings of biblical and mythological prowess, specimens that could heat and beat metal with their hands, grow trees from a nut that just lay in their palm, or cause the very ground to tremble and quake with merely a thought. Instead of doing all these things, they were more than content to hang out and eat roasted marshmallows over the fire, talking with Emily about what it was she wanted to do. From what she could find out, they were on a vacation from their realms, needing a break from their own realities. Carjamak the Undying fussed on and on about the adventurers that were after him, peacefully dining on a meal of campfire hot dogs with Emily around the town of Boulder. "It's amazing, these kids will just literally kick down your door and try to kill you just because you raised up a couple of dead families to work in your garden. They're dead. What are they going to do with their bodies anyway? Keep their burial holes warm? Oh, is that Coach Mustard?" Emily found him to be a charming fellow, and he treated her to a small show along with a gaggle of camp kids, reanimating dead squirrels and roadkill to perform Shakespearean plays and scenes from Star Wars. She hated to admit it, but the half-flat squirrel did a damn good job at replicating Luke Skywalker. The diners proved to be another issue entirely. While some were awesome and could whip up a meal worth its weight in elven gold, probably due to the kobold cooks they employed, those little lizards were masters at spice management. Others were on par with extinction-level kitchen events, and their food usually left Emily sprinting off to the side of the road and hoping that a large bush was nearby. It was also Carjamak that told her the secret of wet wipes, and she was still thanking him as she pulled into the parking lot in front of a large Quonset building. She killed the engine and flipped up her visor, looking up at the large sign that adorned the front of the building, right above a rather tall door. "Ogildoc's Recovery and Survey," Emily murmured, muffled by the noise of her helmet. Ogildoc was a weird name, definitely not Terran, just from how it sounded, and she was curious to find out just who ran this joint. She double-checked the locks on her cruiser trailer, placed her helmet down on her seat, and walked up to the front door of the big steel building. The construction was almost overly military, not much in the way of markings or windows, and seemed to favor function over form. There also wasn't much noise coming out from the other side of the door, and that didn't change when she opened it. The small tinkle of a bell rang above her, and Emily jerked her head to see what had caused the noise. The bell was usually the kind you find on motorcycles to ward away engine gremlins, the same kind of bells they used on airplanes since World War II. She cocked an eyebrow at it, but closed the door behind her, the bell giving another crisp ring, again. Instead of a lobby like she was expecting, she was greeted by a long hallway with a series of doors on each side. Her heavy traveling boots thudded on the bland barracks tiles as she walked down the hallway, counting the doors and taking note that many of them had names. Some of the names seemed human, while others had more apostrophes than Jesus had apostles. The hallway eventually opened up into a huge lounge-like area with another set of rooms just beyond. These, however, had windows and looked more like offices, where a few humans typed away at computers, surrounded by collections of odd-looking items and trinkets. The one office that grabbed Emily's attention was one that bore a large name board, with Ogledock painted on it in military spacing. She tilted her head a bit at the person sitting inside the office. As with a name like that, she expected a troll or an orc. Instead, a very haggard-looking changeling sat inside, ruffling through pages of what looked like a docket. Ogledock looked every part of a changeling: pearly white skin, snow-white hair, pale lavender eyes with a shock of white pupil in the center, and his ears being long and pointed much like a sprite's, just darkening on the end like they were overcooked. Ogledock, however, sported the slightly dark under-eyes of someone who was in charge, did not sleep as much as they should, and had a curious pattern of splotches across his nose and cheeks. It looked as if someone had accidentally dropped purple watercolor paint on him, and his face had reacted to it like wet parchment. His hair was definitely not up to the usual style, as he sported it in a kind of short mohawk which reminded Emily of Mr. T in many ways. If Mr. T was half his height, skinny, and looked like someone who could slot into a K-pop boy band. While Ogledock was still busily rifling through papers, Emily took a moment to look around the room, slowly spinning on the spot as she did. It felt more akin to the barracks area of an infantry unit than a company leisure room. To one wall there was a pair of fridges and a double set of stoves. Above them sitting cabinets and pantries that held enough snack food to satiate a platoon of Marines. The canyon-like washing sink even had fresh dishes in it, stuck with the remains of what Emily guessed was a burrito. The other side of the room was littered with chairs, couches, beanbags, easy recliners, and a couple of futons. The whole motley crew of furniture adorned with multiple colors of wooby poncho liners. The TV they had was huge, some kind of massive flat screen that could be seen from the next building over. Below its stand was a glittering of gaming systems, a stereo, and a Blu-ray player, all jumbled together like a hellish rat king. And of course the scene would not be complete without a billiards table, and Emily could tell the old girl saw a lot of use. "I see you found the place well enough." Emily spun around at the crisp American accent and saw that Ogledock was staring out at her from his door, having silently opened it and observing her the entire time she looked around. She rallied herself and patted the thighs of her 5'11" pants, doing her best to smile at Ogledock. His voice was light and airy, and to be frank, she half expected him to have sounded like the Mr. T changeling she had seen in her head. "Yes, well, I had like 30 people giving me directions, so it wasn't too hard to worm my way here." "Indeed," mused Ogledock, and he cracked a smile at her. His canines were huge, and she quietly wondered how they fit in his mouth. "Well, why don't you step inside my office and we'll discuss what happens next, then?" Ogledock stood aside and held open the door for Emily, who stepped sideways to move past him. For some reason, he smelled like blood and cinnamon. It was not a smell she found particularly pleasant. Neither would I, they don't really mix. She sat down in the old leather chair in front of his desk, and he plopped down into his own wheeled chair, giving himself a jaunty spin while he blew air out of his cheeks. They were both quiet for a moment, staring at each other when he spun around to face her, and Emily felt a knot of nervousness twist in her tummy. Ogledock finally broke the silence, reaching over and rustling in a tin of Altoids as he spoke. "Cinnamon flavor," she noted. "Saw your stream. Been watching for a while now, since there are some days where I don't leave this place and I need something to listen to. When I hear you say you were wanting to start this gig, I figured I'd toss you a bill and an address." Ogledock eyed her as if he were a platoon sergeant talking to a private about a promotion, and popped one of the Altoids into his mouth, instantly crunching his teeth down onto it. Emily twitched her mouth up into a small smile, her foot bouncing on the toe from the awkwardness of it all. "He's a fan? Great," she thought before clearing her throat a little. "Well, it's always easier getting into a business when you know someone on the inside, I guess." "True," Ogledock said, turning in his chair and pulling a packet from a filing cabinet. "I figured you'd go off and get yourself killed in some skank tar company." I could hope that you would come to me so I could get your toes properly wet. He thumped the packet of papers on his desk towards Emily, and she leaned forward to look down at it. This is your contract. In here it outlines the cut you get of the items found, insurances, the places I can and will send you, and the kind of subjects you can expect to run into. We've been running into bands of ferals around the mountains nowadays, offshoots from more rustic and early age dimensions. Also, here. Ogledock flipped through a few of the pages until he had found one labeled ammunition and automats. Is the ammo we will reimburse you for, as well as repairs to your vehicle and or living mount. You can fill these out in the break room and bring them back to me when you're done. Emily flinched when he tossed a pen onto the packet and looked at Ogledock bemused. What makes you think I'm going to sign up today? This is just my first stop, you know. Ogledock rolled his neck over to look at her and raised his brows. Oh yeah? I know you Googled us already. What's our loss rate? Emily swayed side to side a little, looking upwards with her eyes as she thought. Total loss of personnel is 5 since discovery of artifacts. And what is the rate of McDaggard's retrieval? He said, leaning backwards in his chair while pulling out his smartphone. Emily grimaced as she remembered the fatality numbers of that company in particular, speaking out painfully. Well, they've lost 23 crew members since just last week. Ogledock opened his arms in an expansive number and put a cocky grin upon his face. Damn, I'm good at my job. He gave a short chuckle before sitting back up, facing Emily directly. Look, Emily, I wouldn't have given you the damn address if I didn't know I could keep your ass alive. I've kept my people as alive as I could by giving them the information they need and the time they need. I don't push you, I don't break you, I just ask that you bring something back from the field. I treat my people just as they should be, like people, not like robots to go dig treasure. Yes, we're not as fancy, and our building might be an old updated hangar, but you can sleep knowing I won't toss your life into the lay just for a shiny ring. Now sign those damn papers so I can get your room issued to you. Emily squinted an eye at him, pursing her lips for dramatic effect. You're a little heavy on the sell. Shut up. Ogledock snarled back in a very obvious humor, and he grinned at her with a big pearly fang as she picked up the packet and walked out of his office, moving over to a futon that had a small table in front of it. Working through the packet of papers reminded her a lot of buying a car or signing up for an apartment lease. A lot of filling in boxes and initialing things that didn't really make a lot of sense to her, mostly being in legal jargon. She had worked through half the packet when the rear door near the stoves opened, and Emily looked over her shoulder to see who it was. The sun was bright out, still midday, so the looming shadow was hard to see until it fully came within the building. But Emily knew the body type well enough. Using her rear leg, the female centaur kicked the door shut behind her, her braided tail swishing back and forth. Unlike the centaurs of Casper, this one looked like she meant business. Her hair was jet black, and the sides were shaved into an undercut, and the rest was bundled behind her head in a loose ponytail. Her eyes were not wide and cheerful, but narrow and angry, as if she was always seeing something that annoyed her. In all respects, she was quite beautiful. Her face clear and fresh, except for a few small scars here and there on her chin and forehead. Her attire was also starkly different, wearing clothes that suited more a pilot than the usual valley look she was used to. Around her torso she wore a crisp white shirt and a leather bomber jacket, her aviators propped on top of her head near her ears, while around her withers she had some kind of centaur day pack, stuffed with things like water bottles and her wallet from the looks of it. Her eyes were as light blue as morning sky, and at the current time they were staring daggers at Ogledock. Og! She barked, her voice broody and husky, and her hoofboots made hollow thumps as she strode towards his office. Og, seeing her, suddenly lurched into motion from his easy lays and scrambled towards the door. Og, I got that stupid espresso machine for your streamer girl heartthrob. Even has a little tube thing to make the milk foamy. Emily noticed that, indeed, she was holding a large box that inside held a Breville Express, a mildly high-end machine that usually ran the gambit of $500 to $600 a unit. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows and watch Ogledock stumble out of his office, snatching the box from the centaur. He wasn't prepared for its weight and almost dropped the machine as his arm suddenly had to strain with what the centaur found to be a casual weight. Ogledock's voice went up an octave in his attempts to shush her. No, it's for the company, Marill, not just for Emily. You guys are spending so much on coffee that I just thought... Marill stared down at the changeling and crossed her arms, arching an eyebrow. Just thought you'd spend $650 on a fancy espresso machine? Sure, lie to me. Ogledock glared up at Muriel while struggling to hold the heavy box, and manhandled it over to the counter, sliding it across the smooth wood. When he gained his breath back, Ogledock spun around and clapped his hands together, going back to the level of voice he had first used with Emily. Emily, allow me to introduce Muriel, our weapons technician and heavy retrieval expert. He gestured towards Emily, who was now trying to suppress giggles from the futon, and Muriel looked from Emily to Ogledock, her own block-eared teeth flashing a grin, almost as if she was enjoying Ogledock's flustering. Ah, I see. I got here a little too early with a gift, did I? Ogledock's skin tone gave a ripple as anger coursed through him, and Emily saw his eyes rapidly change colors before going back to their pale lavender. It's for the company, Muriel! Muriel gave a short, dry chuckle. Right. She trotted over to Emily and held out a rough hand to her, which Emily gripped back firmly. I'm Muriel. I keep machines working around there and grab stuff that's heavy. I also... She released Emily's hand and cracked her fingers. Keep Og's internet speeds running smoothly so that way he can watch you juggle magazines. Ogledock's hair was raising up like an angry cat's fur, and his eyes were going between shades of amber and crimson. Muriel... He growled, and Muriel gave a swish of her tail, smiling at him and leaning her head down to Emily. I seen him watching the stream from start to finish a few times. He's a big fan of your pajam. Muriel, I swear to Cringer! Ogledock yelled and picked up a boot, tossing it at the centaur in a rage. Emily and Muriel leaned to the right as the boot went sailing far left, and the two of them both laughed at Ogledock's expense. The changeling whipped out a pocket knife and loudly began to cut open the box for the espresso machine, all while cursing Muriel in his mother tongue. Muriel chuckled some more and tucked her hands into her bomber jacket pockets. Such a fussy two-leg. I'm gonna go take off my pack and check my emails. See you later, Emily. Good luck, Emily said, and she couldn't help but smile at Muriel as she walked away, her braided tail swinging side to side. It was strange. All Muriel wore was a modesty strap when usually all the centaurs wore full hind covers. Must be a in-the-field thing, she mused. Emily continued filling out her paperwork as Ogledock set up the machine, and every once in a while she would look over her shoulder to see what colors he was changing. It reminded her of the old moon rings from her childhood as his hair would quickly flicker between shades of red, and she had to work hard to try and suppress her fits of giggles. Around the time she finished signing the last page, she heard the soft hiss of the stem and the low hum of the machine behind her. She stood and shuffled the papers together, giving them a sharp tap on the coffee table, before turning around and walking towards Ogledock. From what she could see, he was testing out and going through the post-unboxing checklist for the machine, running down the list in a very military manner. Emily saddled it beside him and placed the filled-out packet next to the machine. So, Emily said curtly, admiring the gleaming steel machine as it busily ground up a serving of coffee beans. Decided to remind me of my old job, did you? Sounds like something a huge fan would do. Ogledock went from a mild look of happy list-checking to a furrow-browed mask of annoyance, looking up from the list in his hands to the machine without moving his head. As I said, this is for the company, since it's better than drip coffee and you can warm milk with it. If you keep bugging me about it, I'm going to edit your percentage in the contract. Emily held up her hands. Hey now, no need to get feisty, boss man. Ugh, don't call me that. I'm not big on titles. Just call me Ogledock. Or Og, as Muriel seems to like to. Ogledock held up a finger with one hand as he clicked the portafilter into place with the other. The only reason why she is allowed to call me that is because she is bigger than me, faster than me, and you saw her biceps. She could run me down and choke me out as if I was a toddler. Oh, come on now. You're not that short. You're at least average in height. Emily mused, and noticed that she too was around an inch or two taller than the changeling. Yeah, but most of the taller races view a smaller fae as babies, it seems like. Ogledock murmured this as he watched the dark chocolate-colored liquid fizz and gurgle into the shot glass, which had one side in fae script and the other in English, which said, "Dive for the booty," in broad black letters. The two sat side by side as the espresso poured into the cup. Once the machine was done with its duty, Ogledock grabbed a jug of milk and got it going under the spigot. Emily leaned forward on her elbows, resting them on the counter, and she idly criticized Ogledock the entire time while swaying her hips back and forth. You gonna scald the milk doing that? No, I'm not. I'm holding the angle it said to in the book. Oh yeah? Then what are those little brown bits then, expert? Oggledok swirled his milk, and a cluster of burnt milk swirled up to greet him. He clicked his teeth in aggravation and pulled the milk away, giving it a sniff. God damn it. Emily took off her motorcycle jacket and cracked her knuckles playfully, despite only a few pops actually emanating from her fingers. Step aside, rookie. Let the professionals handle this. Oggledok rolled his head around to look at her sarcastically while still holding his ruined milk, then gave the mess a splash into the sink before rinsing out the cup. When all the burnt milk was scrubbed out, he handed Emily the little tin container. Floor's yours, dirt worker. Emily grinned at him smugly as she plucked the cup from his hand and poured in a measure of the whole milk from the jug, then popping it under the spigot. True to form, Emily had the milk hissing and burbling in a more controlled manner, swirling it expertly and moving it around the container so the heat distributed evenly. While Oggledok had burned the milk, Emily had it heated and frothing perfectly. She reached up to grab a mug from the many hooks that adorned the wall, quite a few adorned with mugs of various shapes and sizes. The other office doors opened, and Emily heard voices call out behind her. "Hey now, something smells good over there," called a female voice with a male voice ringing out after her. "Must be Emily." A fresh-faced young woman, looking like she was straight out of high school, bopped up next to Emily, looking around her arm as she spooned in the milk foam. "Ooh, can you make me one of those? I'll give you the larger room with the extra plug-ins." Oggledok whirled around. "Hey now, hold on." "Done," Emily chirped and used a nearby chopstick to draw a heart in the foam. The young woman took the mug while giggling happily, then held out her free hand. "I'm Jane. I manage supply for the at-home operations." Emily took her hand and introduced herself, while Jane, with her ruddy blonde hair and happy hazel eyes, looked the part of a simple secretary. The man who walked towards them from the other office seemed like he had popped out of an army recruitment poster. He introduced himself as Davin, shook Emily's hand, and then went back to his office after pouring more drip coffee into his travel mug. Jane took a loud slurp of her cappuccino, the foam forming a right proper milk mustache, and leaned towards Emily. "Davin is a man of few words, ex-ranger, got bored at home, does this for fun. He manages the field expenses and such things." Jane smacked her lips and took another sip from her mug while looking over at Oggledok, who was frowning slightly and looking at the mug. His face red, but that was mine, plain as day. His eyes warped through shades of blue. Emily noticed and gave him a small smirk. "Here, give me another mug and I'll make you one too, Augie." At Emily's words, Oggledok's hair and eyes flashed a myriad of colors as if he was a startled cuttlefish. But he reached up and grabbed a mug all the same. "Just Oggledok will do." Emily filled the portafilter with more grounds and plugged it into place while warming more milk. This time Oggledok was smiling and drumming his fingers on the counter, knowing the next cup was his. Emily doodled a cat face in his and handed him the mug, much to the changeling's glee. Emily heard the soft thuds of horse boots behind her and shook her head with a rueful smile as she began to create a centaur-sized mug. When she turned around with the pint-sized mug in her hands, Muriel at least had the decency to look embarrassed, still wearing her bomber jacket and the white shirt underneath it. "Sorry, it just smelled really good." "Not a problem. Just don't spill it. This thing is like $10 worth of coffee." Muriel took the huge mug with a content smile and perked her ears up as she slurped from it, looking over at Oggledok and Jane, who were both spooning the milk foam into their mouths with their fingers. Bunch of children. Emily took a few minutes to clean the machine, whistling as she did so, and felt somehow more chipper about doing it for fun instead of having to do so because she was being paid. Making coffee for her coworkers felt more wholesome than, say, making coffee for a bunch of gremlins that always insist on paying her in shiny beetles. She finished cleaning up the machine and turned, leaning back slightly on the counter and enjoying the little group of happy faces that were nose-deep in their coffee mugs. If just making coffee was this satisfying, she was keen to find out what finding her first relic would feel like. When mugs were empty and washed in the sink, Jane snapped back into managing gear and issued Emily her bunk room, the key of which was rune-etched and required a drop of blood to bind to her. The blood came in the form of a single drop, Jane using one of those hospital finger prickers that made the loud click sound after it poked you. After plugging it into the keyhole, the doorknob became attuned to her body along with the key, meaning that no one but her could work the lock. The key itself seemed to be alive, and Emily could catch it humming to itself every once in a while when it thought she wasn't paying attention. The room itself was very Spartan. The furniture seemed to mostly comprise odds and ends of different sets. Her bed was a queen-size steel-frame bed that had rows of shelves underneath it. An external locker closet that must have been from a literal army barracks as it had little drawers inside for your socks, small items, t-shirts, a little cubby for boots, and then the normal hanger rod for longer things that couldn't fit in the drawers. Inside the metal door was a row of names, and Emily took a moment to read them all. Starting at the top of the locker was a name, a rank, and a date, which continued down through almost 2 decades of names. Most of the names started with the rank of private, all of them from Charlie Company, and kept the same pattern until it had a regular name, the newest if he could tell, which was dated almost a year ago. Emily tapped her nail on the metal door a few times before moving away and rummaging around the inside of her travel bag. After a bit of searching, she found a Sharpie and popped the cap off of it, the pungent odor of the ink stinging her nose. Near the top of the locker door, beside the very first name, she wrote her own name, murmuring as she did, Emily Bronze, Relic Diver, September 13th, 2037. She clicked the cap back on top of the marker and blew softly on the ink to dry it, giving the door a little wiggle as she did. She admired her name and the others for a few more moments before unpacking the rest of her things. All of her clothes, jackets, and gear fit nice and snugly inside of the locker, and the gun rack became quickly full of her own rifles. The pistol rack was positioned near her bed, a place she could agree with it being, and she made sure all of them were battle-ready in case something decided to yeet itself through her window. The desk was a monster construction of steel with dark wood cabinets, and Emily reckoned she could toss it out of a 4-story window just to damage the surface it landed on. The thing was extremely heavy as well, which became a problem when she tried to get her Ethernet cable into the jack. The room between it and the wall was barely a thin hand of space, and she ended up having to call Marilla in for help. With a bit of envy, Emily saw that the centaur had no issues with the heavy desk, and just scooted it out of the way with ease. With that out of the way, she was able to get her gaming laptop up and running without further issue, and decompressed with a bit of web browsing for a few hours. Once satiated on memes and videos of people wrecking their cars, she made her bed up with mostly just an undersheet and a blanket. She didn't really have room for her large comforter, so her wool travel blanket would have to do until she was able to get out to the store in town to buy some new ones. No time was like the present, so she grabbed her motorcycle jacket and threw it back on over her shoulder holster. After locking her door, she felt her key humming to itself again, and it felt like it kept humming the same tune over and over again, a ditty of some unknown name. After she tucked the key into her top pocket, she pulled out her phone and a pair of earbuds. With her helmet being Bluetoothed, she could answer calls and listen to music on the fly, but for now she tucked an earbud into one ear and then tucked the other one into her pocket. Perhaps this way the key could learn a new tune or two. The ride into the inner city was pleasant enough for a motorbike ride, and she noticed the foot traffic was as varied as it was in Casper. The only real change she noticed was that almost all of the beings she saw were armed to the teeth in one way or another. Centaurs carried rifles or axes on their backs, humans had a holstered pistol of some kind, trolls sported large caliber short barrel rifles low at their sides, and every other race seemed to carry some form of weaponry or another. Also, unlike Casper, the place was awash with food trucks, and almost every corner had one of them selling their tasty goods to passers-by. The variety was astounding as well, everything from tacos to borscht to go being on offer by the creatures that ran the truck. She spied a few that even had drive-through windows, and buried that nugget of information away for another time. Blessedly, there was a new Bed, Bath & Beyond near the main shopping square, and Emily had a time of picking out some fresh towels, a pillow, matching set of sheets, and a fluffy new comforter to adorn her new bed. Well, new to her. It didn't smell all that fresh, but who knows where it was before it got to her room. Later that night, when everything was put away, she set her key down next to her laptop. Again, she placed a set of earbuds on the key and put on a punk music list for the key to jam to through the night, giving the little piece of metal a small pat as if it were a familiar. "Good night, key," Emily said, then felt weird because she told the damn thing good night in the first place. She sat on the side of her bed and picked up the small container with the remains of her taco truck dinner, and popped the last morsel of pork into her mouth, chewing as she took off her shoulder holster. While the room felt alien now, she knew it was just nerves for being in a new place. When she got back from her shopping trip, the building was quiet, and she could hear people moving about here and there in the hallway or inside their rooms. With a puff of air to get the hair out of her eyes, she set her phone alarm for 8 a.m. and plugged it into its charger, having drained quite a bit of battery playing music for the key. She took off her boots, her socks, her pants, and her shirt, and decided that was good enough for tonight's pajamas. Settling under her new comforter as the unfamiliar noises echoed around her, she could hear Oggledock speaking to Jane, Marill's heavy metal jams, the typing of keyboards in the room next door, someone making a late-night dinner, and the very constant clicking of controller joysticks. She had heard these new people come in while she was setting up her bed, but she decided that she was all peopled out for the day, figuring she would just meet them in the morning. Sleep was hard to come by, but it eventually came, slowly dragging Emily's mind off to the land of dreams to be forgotten in the morning. She thought about her old life, the people she had met today, how fucking awkward Ockledock was, Marill's bulging biceps, and just how much she hated the old coffee machines when compared to the smaller, newer espresso machine that sat in the company kitchen. For a bit of reassurance, she rested her hand on her CZ75 as she fell asleep. That way she would know it was there for her and not an unknown lump in the darkness. Morning came far faster than Emily had expected, her alarm blaring in her ear and jerking her awake from the dream she was having. As it faded from her mind, she remembered that it had something to do with cannibalistic jelly beans, but none of the finer details were coming to her. She stretched in the morning sun and adjusted her sports bra, smacking her lips. Her mouth had the usual morning taste of burnt rubber and muck, and she knew just the thing to burn it away. She rolled out of bed, hopped into the small corner bathroom to shower and do her dailies, popped on some fresh casual clothes, then opened the door to her room. The hallway was still dark, as well as the company area, so Emily clicked on a few lights and warmed up the espresso machine. While it gurgled away, she made a bowl of something called apple scooteros, pouring in the milk after she steamed some for her coffee. With little celebration, she flung the espresso and milk into a mug, then carried it and the bowl to the futon in front of the TV. As she watched the morning news, she propped her feet up on the coffee table and gave them a wiggle, spooning the scooteros into her mouth while her coffee steamed happily nearby. Now that she thought about it, it's pretty comfy being here, and the people were nice enough. What she did wonder was just when she was getting to get her first job, and just what it may be that she found, whether it was something that glittered or just a few new friends. Emily was up for anything. End of Chapter 2.
And that's the end of Chapter 2 of Emily Bronze. If you like this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to Garbeardia and click the bell icon so you know when the next chapter of your favorite story comes out through the week. Also be advised, if you wish to donate to the Beldam directly on the coffee, be sure you label it with the story and or her name, so that way she gets her cut of the donations. Also be sure to stop by Skull Splitter Dice and get your click-clack shiny math rocks. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Garbeardia.